This is the parable of the rich fool. Luke 12:13-21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, 'You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God.'"
Okay, so we've just heard the reading of the rich fool, taken from Luke 12:13-21. So I suppose the question with all these parables is what led to Jesus telling a particular story, a particular parable? What is the context for what happens next? Now we have here a clear description of why Jesus told this story, in that there was a question from the crowd. An unidentified person asked the question about, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he shouts out this command, this concern. Now, questions about inheritance law were often given to the rabbis at the time. They will give a legal ruling according to the Torah on how such inheritance should be divided between family members. If you want to look at the Torah teaching on this, you can go back to Deuteronomy chapter 21. So Jesus is obviously here being considered or seen as a rabbi, someone who had the authority to interpret on an issue of religious law. Religious law, of course, has huge practical implications, in this case about inheritance and passing on from one generation to the next, family wealth and family resources. I suppose, again, we begin to ask the question, what motivates the man to shout out this request? What is the motivation behind him? A bit like we saw in the story earlier of the Good Samaritan. Was this a test? Was this a kind of a genuine inquiry, a genuine encounter with Jesus? Now, Jesus does not answer the question directly, although clearly he had the authority to do so. So maybe he senses that the questioner or the person shouting out this request is motivated by bad motives. Maybe there's a sense of greed in what he wants and why he's saying what he says. If you look at the story which Jesus tells then, the rich fool is very, very self-obsessed. 6 times in the text, the word "I" is used. I will do this. I will build this barn. I will go and do this. So it's as if the rich fool is believing he is totally in control of his destiny. It's all about him. And then after this very short story concludes, it concludes with this kind of judgment of God in verse 20, where God says to him, "You fool." It's a very strong word. It's used earlier in Luke's Gospel, and Paul uses the same word in Ephesians 5, verse 17, where he's talking about the foolishness of some believers within the church. So the term fool here really means someone who is obsessed with themselves and isolated from any awareness of God. And you see particularly in the Psalms this contrast again and again between the wise and the foolish. And Jesus picks up on some of this in his own teaching. Now, of course, perhaps the best known description of a fool in the Psalms is Psalm 14, verse 1. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good." The fool says in his heart, "There is no God." And in a sense, this rich fool here is living out his life without any awareness of God. Now, of course, the challenge is with this richness, you can't take your riches with you. When you die, that is an end of your riches. And I think the question which kind of comes to all of us when we look at this kind of parable is we see the foolishness and the greed of this rich person in the story of Jesus. But again, we can also turn the question back to ourselves. Are there selfish agendas in our own life? Are there things which take us away from God? Are we striving to climb a ladder of success only to find that it doesn't end up in the place we feel we should be? Now, clearly, ambition and working hard and planning ahead are good things. But the key is the motivation. What is our goal for doing that? Have we got a self-centered agenda, or are we trying to bless others and honor God by what we do? So as we look at this story of the rich fool, I suppose there's questions for all of us, in the church especially. How can I make sure I cultivate an attitude which is rich towards God? How can I be generous to the poor? How can I prioritize investment in worship? How can I make sure my giving reflects the biblical principle of generosity and the principle of tithing? These are important biblical principles which the rich fool has no awareness of. Now, clearly, in terms of giving, there's a saying which I always find very kind of challenging, that sometimes you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. Sometimes you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. And as we love and as we give as Christians, God breaks the hold money has on some of our lives, and we discover a new freedom. So as we read this parable, we just pray that God's Spirit will challenge us about our attitudes to money and possessions and inheritance. May we make sure we're in line with God, and by being in line with God, we will be wise and not foolish. Thanks for listening.